Level/Type 1. Every expedition in this video had a moment where turning back was still possible. However, in each case, someone made the decision to continue, and that decision got them all killed. These are their stories. The Andrée Expedition. On July 11, 1897, 3 men lifted off from the Arctic in a hydrogen balloon bound for the North Pole. Salomon August André was 42 years old, a Swedish engineer with a reputation for methodical precision. His 2 companions were Niels Strindberg, a 25-year-old physicist, and Knut Frankel, a 26-year-old civil engineer. The balloon was called the Eagle. It measured 20.5 meters in diameter and carried approximately 4,800 cubic meters of hydrogen. André had spent years planning this attempt. He had secured funding from Alfred Nobel and the Swedish king. He had studied Arctic wind patterns extensively. What he had not disclosed publicly was that his pre-launch calculations contained a fundamental error in the balloon's hydrogen retention rate. The Eagle was designed to remain airborne for approximately 30 days. Internal documents later recovered showed André had estimated a hydrogen loss rate of roughly 50 liters per hour. The actual loss rate, measured during pre-launch preparations, was closer to 170 liters per hour. He had proceeded anyway. The Arctic did not kill them first. Certainty did. And once a man trusts the numbers he already knows are false, the disaster has already begun. Level/Type 2. In 524 BC, Persian king Cambyses II dispatched an army of 50,000 soldiers into the western desert. None of them returned. Their reported objective was the Siwa Oasis, where the Oracle of Amun held both religious authority and political value. The route crossed one of the driest sectors of Egypt's western desert. Water points were sparse. Landmarks were limited. A large force could move through it only if supply, timing, and weather held. None of those conditions held. The army departed from Karga Oasis, approximately 300 kilometers southeast of Siwa. The march required crossing open desert with no reliable shade, no permanent water sources, and no established road. Ancient sources record that the column was approximately 7 days into the march when conditions deteriorated. Temperatures in the western desert regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius in late spring. A force of 50,000 men, animals, and supply carriers required enormous quantities of water daily. The logistical margin was already thin before the sandstorm arrived. Ancient accounts describe a violent sandstorm from the south. Visibility collapsed. Direction vanished. Pack animals failed first. Water stores were buried or lost. Unit cohesion broke down across the column. Men separated in blowing sand in extreme heat. They did not reach Siwa. The desert covered the army completely. Level/Type 3. Sir John Franklin, Arctic Expedition. On May 19, 1845, 2 ships left the Thames estuary carrying 129 men and enough provisions for 3 years. The HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were among the most technologically advanced vessels in the British Royal Navy. They carried steam-powered engines, iron-reinforced hulls, and a heating system designed to keep crews alive through Arctic winters. Franklin was 59 years old and a decorated naval officer. He had survived 2 previous Arctic expeditions. The Admiralty considered him the safest possible choice. What they did not adequately consider was that his previous expeditions had also nearly killed him, and that the Arctic had not changed. By late summer, the ships entered Lancaster Sound and vanished into the pack ice. Search parties later found the record at Victory Point. It showed Franklin died on June 11, 1847. By April 1848, the survivors abandoned both ships. 24 officers and men had already died. None of the 129 returned alive. But Franklin's ships were not the last to trust Arctic confidence over what the ice had already shown. Level/Type 4.
USS Jeannette, Arctic Expedition. In 1879, George de Long sailed into pack ice that had already crushed stronger ships and trapped them for years, but most retellings treat the disaster as sudden, as if the Arctic gave no warning. It did. Whalers, naval officers, and polar veterans had documented the same pattern for decades. The ice closed early. It drifted without warning. It gripped hulls until timbers opened. DeLong had those reports before departure. He proceeded anyway, carrying a theory that warm currents would open a route where repeated experience said they would not. As a result, the voyage began under a false premise. Jeanette entered the Chukchi Sea and reached Herald Island before the pack tightened around her. On September 5, 1879, the ice took the ship. Engine power did nothing. Sails did nothing. The hull became cargo inside a moving field of pressure ridges and leads. For nearly 2 years, the crew drifted northwest with the frozen pack, recording soundings, temperatures, and position fixes as the Arctic carried them farther from any planned route. By June 1881, the pressure increased. Timbers groaned. Seams failed. On June 12th, the hull gave way and Jeanette sank beneath the ice. Months later, the drift carried what remained of the expedition toward a different coast and a different season. Level Type 5, the Depot Incident. On April 21, 1861, Robert O'Hara Burke returned to Cooper's Creek to find the camp abandoned and the supply party gone. The timing was exact. William Braw and his men had waited there until the morning of April 21st. They buried food, marked the cache, and left only hours before Burke, William John Wills, and John King came back from the Gulf route. The margin was less than a day. It may have been only a few hours. That delay decided everything. If the three men misread distance, watt, or strength from that point forward, there was no reserve left in the system. The depot had been their fixed point. Without it, every calculation changed. Burke chose not to pursue Brahe south. He chose to head for Mount Hopeless instead. The route crossed dry country. Their rations thinned quickly. Physical decline began before they even cleared the creek line. Wills weakened first. Burke followed. They survived for a time on Nardoo and small amounts of meat, but the diet failed them. Starvation advanced with dehydration and exhaustion. Wills died near Brearley Waterhole. Burke died soon after. King remained alive only because local Yandruwanda people fed him until the search party found him. Level Type 6, Percy Fawcett, Amazon Expedition. On 20th May 1925, Percy Fawcett walked into the Mato Grosso jungle of central Brazil and was never seen again. The 57-year-old British explorer had spent nearly 2 decades surveying South American terrain for the Royal Geographical Society. He had mapped border regions across Bolivia, Brazil, and Peru. He had survived 4 previous Amazon expeditions. He was one of the most experienced jungle surveyors alive. He believed he was weeks away from finding a lost ancient city he called Z. That belief hardened over years of field notes, pottery fragments, earthworks, and repeated reports from local communities describing old roads and ruined stone sites deeper inland. Fawcett treated these accounts as converging data points, not folklore. By 1925, he had narrowed his search to the Xingu region and spoke as if the final approach had already begun. He traveled with his elder son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Reimel. The party left Cuiabá with pack animals, supplies, rifles, sextants, and survey gear. The route passed through Bakairi territory toward Dead Horse Camp, where Fawcett sent his last confirmed letter on 29 May. He dismissed further assistance. He ordered carriers back. After that, the trail ended. What happened next was reconstructed from fragments. Indigenous accounts collected later described 3 white men moving east in deteriorating condition. One version placed them near Kalapalo territory, where a dispute followed warnings not to continue. Another claimed all 3 were killed soon after crossing the last known villages. No remains were ever verified. Level Type 7, the HMS Bounty, Breadfruit Transport Mission. On December 23, 1787, Lieutenant William Bligh sailed from Spithead, England, with a crew of 45 men and orders he was not permitted to question. The Royal Navy had assigned him a singular objective: collect breadfruit plants from Tahiti and transport them to the West Indies, where British plantation owners believed the fruit would serve as cheap food for enslaved workers. The mission had been designed by wealthy interests and approved at the highest levels of the Admiralty. Bligh's authority to modify it was effectively non-existent. The Bounty had been refitted specifically for the plants. The great cabin, normally reserved for the commanding officer, had been converted into a greenhouse. Bligh was assigned a small, windowless space adjacent to it. The crew quarters were compressed accordingly. 45 men shared what remained. The Bounty was 90 feet long. The accommodation was inadequate before the voyage began. The journey to Tahiti took 10 months. Bligh attempted to round Cape Horn in late April 1788, but sustained storms with winds exceeding 40 knots forced him back after 30 days of failed attempts. He altered course for the Cape of Good Hope and arrived at Tahiti in October 1788, nearly a year after departure. The crew remained on the island for 5 months, while the breadfruit cuttings were cultivated for transport. That delay changed everything. The return voyage began on April 4, 1789. Discipline tightened. Rations were monitored. Shore freedoms ended. Bligh also divided dwindling stores after coconuts went missing, and he accused men he believed were stealing from him. These were small failures of command, but they accumulated in close quarters. By April 28, the errors had become operational. Level Type 8. On May 10, 1996, 8 climbers died on the slopes of Mount Everest during a single storm. They were not inexperienced. They were not unprepared by the standards of the day. Several had summited major peaks before. Their guides held some of the strongest high-altitude resumes in the world. What killed them was not one mistake. It was a sequence of decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one making the next error slightly more likely until the chain was too long to break. The 1996 Everest disaster did not begin with the storm. It began weeks earlier, with choices that seemed entirely defensible at the time. 2 commercial expeditions were operating on the mountain simultaneously that season. Adventure Consultants, led by New Zealand guide Rob Hall, and Mountain Madness, led by American Scott Fisher, had both accepted paying clients, some with limited high-altitude experience. The presence of multiple teams created logistical pressure that neither leader fully acknowledged. Bottlenecks at fixed ropes slowed progress. Turnaround times, which Hall had publicly committed to enforcing, became difficult to hold in practice. On summit day, May 10th, climbers were still ascending past the agreed cutoff hour. Hall knew this. Fisher knew this. Neither turned their teams around. The delays multiplied above 8,000 meters. Oxygen ran low. Weather deteriorated. Doug Hansen collapsed high on the mountain with Hall beside him. Fisher became incapacitated during descent near the balcony. Yasuko Namba died in the storm. Beck Weathers and Makalu Gao were left for dead but survived. Hall, Hansen, Fisher, Andy Harris, and Namba never came down.